Hey, what's going on, guys? My name is Agent Psycho, aka ToSniper98. In this video, I'll be going over a handful of hidden mechanics in FGO that the game either references, but doesn't explain or straight up doesn't tell you about. Most of the things we'll be discussing here fall into the latter category, and your mileage may vary with the practicality of these mechanics, so take these with a grain of salt, hopefully not from the gacha. Probably the most distinct mechanic of this game is the class advantage system, which dictates that in general, one class is strong against another class and weak against the third. But there's a second advantage subsystem, the attribute advantage system. The game references it in two places, Emiya's Interlude and London, which is intended to tip you off to its existence and explain its story relevance, but otherwise doesn't elaborate on its actual gameplay effects. All servants and enemies, including mobs, have an attribute associated with them, either man, earth, sky, or in an English version, heaven, star, or beast. Just like the class advantage system, attributes are strong against another attribute but weak to a third, but since there are only 5 attributes in the game so far, it's much simpler. Man has 10% bonus damage against sky but 10% penalty against earth, sky has 10% bonus against earth but 10% penalty against man, and earth has 10% bonus against man but 10% penalty against sky. Star and Beast, which are the other attributes, have their own interaction in which they both deal 10% bonus damage against each other. Since these are all only 10% bonuses and penalties we're talking about, for the most part attribute advantage won't factor greatly into a fight, since class advantage is much more impactful. It's most tangible in situations where you're buff stacking heavily to the point where even a 10% bonus or penalty to a servant's damage will mean the difference between a kill or not. Enemies in FGO have standardized critical hit rates that are categorized by class, as this infograph shows. Sabers, Lancers, Casters, Zerks, Rulers, Avengers, and Mooncancers all have base 10% to crit, Riders and Alter Egos have 15%, Archers and Foreigners 20%, and Assassins 30%. These should apply to both enemy mobs and enemy servants. Like the Nasuverse taught us, there are always exceptions. Bicorns, Demon Pillars, and Knight class Werewolves, Jaguars, and Goblins all have 20% base, Chimeras, Wyverns, and Ghosts have 30% base, and worst of all, Assassin class Werewolves, Jaguars, and Goblins have 60%. So in case you've ever wondered why these particular enemies critted you all the time, now you know. Speaking of class-specific mechanics, there are also class-specific star gen and MP generation rates for your servants depending on the class that they attack. For MP gen, your servants have normal MP gen against all enemy Knight classes. Cavalry classes get interesting. Riders give 10% bonus MP gen for your servants, and casters give 20%. This is part of the reason why riders tend to have such good MP gen, because they're effective against casters to begin with. Assassins give 10% penalty to MP gen for your servants, and Berserkers are the worst at 20% penalty. Extra classes generally give standard MP gen rates with the exception of Mooncancers, who are like casters and give 20% bonus. While this isn't a class, against most undead enemies your servants also have a special 20% bonus MP gen rate. So for example, against Assassin class Ghosts, your servants will have a 0.9x times 1.2x MP gen modifier, or in total a 1.08x mod. This is why undead enemies were frequently the starting mobs you faced in a challenge quest for the first 2 waves, so that you can use them to get your servants' MPs charged up more quickly. However, apparently this undead bonus mod has been inconsistent because after a certain point in time in the game, the bonus just stopped working. Maybe someone can specify exactly when that time was in the comments, or if this bonus is even in the game anymore. As for star generation rates against specific enemy classes, your servants have neutral star generation rates against Sabers, Casters, Berserkers, and most extra classes so far. Archers give you 5% bonus, and Riders also give you a 10% bonus. Lancers give you a 5% penalty, and Assassins and Avengers give you 10% penalty. On the subject of Star Gen, all three card types are capable of it. Quick is obviously the best at it since it's advertised as its key feature, but Arts and Buster can do it too under the right circumstances, specifically if you're working with servants who have Star Gen rate buffs. Each card type has a Star Gen rate value that can differ depending on the card position in a chain. Arts cards have default 0% Star Gen no matter what their positions are, but Busters have 10% in the first slot, 15% on the second, and 20% on the third, with Quicks having 80%, 130%, and 180%. In order to get Arts and Buster cards to generate any considerable number of stars, you need to both buff your servants to Star Gen rates and make them have high hit counts. In general, Arts and Buster cards have similar or lower hit counts than Quick cards, unless your name is Skaha or Kyo Lancer. This means as face cards, Quick cards are much more reliable at Star Gen than the other two, but I didn't need to tell you that. As a result, typically only Arts and Buster Noble Phantasms can generate any significant number of crit stars, since MPs can have lots of hits on them. If you've ever used Castergil or Suzuka, you've probably noticed this. With their respective skills active, both of them can produce quite a few stars going into the next turn.
宗師枕を紐解けば音の宗師大統領文術剣大神道恋愛ハッパー天気雨
Castergil is perhaps the most notable example here because he has a Tenet Arts AoE MP along with a party-wide 100% Star Gen buff and 30% Party Arts buff, both for 3 turns. Remember that card buffs improve everything about the cards that they're buffing, which includes Star Gen, so Castergil is giving both himself and his whole front line up to 130% Star Gen if they're all using Arts NPs, and still 100% Star Gen even if they're not. He's also a servant you'll likely use for farming, so you may see this in action quite a bit.
魔術のみと自らをし魔術のみと自らをし魔術のみと自らを縛るのも王の奴隷よまそれでもよいか矢を構えよ俺が許す至高の財をもってウルクの守りを見せるがいい
Continuing with the topic of crit stars, FGO has a hidden star weight value that is active every turn. I explained it in my MHXA video, but I'll repeat it here since I feel it's appropriate. Every turn the game adds certain values to each card's star weight, with the exception of MP cards since they can't crit. These values are plus 0, plus 0, plus 20, plus 20, and plus 50, but you can't see which card gets which value until you see where your stars are distributed at the beginning of a turn, and if you're using a team with classes that have very different star weight defaults, it'll be hard to determine these values in the first place. They're added after the game calculates star weights for each card based on factors like default class star weight buffs, and debuffs. This is why MHXA's star weight reduction effect on our third skill sometimes feels like it's doing nothing, and is explicitly noticeable when you're running a team full of berserkers. This mechanic most likely exists to allow servants who have lower than average star weights and don't have their own star weight buffs to have at least a small chance to score crits, though for most of you, the more relevant application of this is to randomly give your support casters a ton of crit stars on one of their cards for seemingly no reason. Critical hit chances themselves also have their own hidden mechanic. The way FGO determines whether or not a card with a crit chance will land that crit is by rolling a number between 1 to 100. If the number the game rolls is below or equal to the chance of a face card, that face card's crit will succeed. For example, if the game rolls a 23 for a card that has a 40% chance to crit, this crit will succeed. However, face card hit counts can be used to manipulate crits. You may have heard from me or others that hit counts are extremely important in FGO, and strangely enough, they can do something like this too. If the hit count total leading up to a face card with a successful crit remains the same, you can maintain that crit. This works in part because the game calculates its values for each position in a chain, not for each individual card. The other part comes from the hit count mechanic we mentioned just now, because each hit leading up to the crit contributes to that crit's RNG state, similar to how using skills while save scumming can change an enemy's attack behavior, and so changing the number of hits leading up to the crit will change the RNG and thus have a chance to nullify that crit success. For example, take a BBQ chain with a quick card anchor having a 10% chance to crit and both of the busted cards having 1 hit each. If you try this chain and find that the quick card does in fact crit, this means that you can save scum to replace that quick crit with another card in your current deck that also has a chance to crit that's got an equal or higher chance to crit, for example a 40% arts card, and that card will also be guaranteed to crit because the total hit count leading up to it is the same from the 2 buster cards and its 40% chance is greater than the quick's 10%. But if you change either of the 2 busters and the cards replacing them change the total hit count leading up to the anchor card, that means that you've changed the RNG on that anchor card, and so whatever card you put there is no longer guaranteed to crit. This is not dependent on specific servants' cards, only on raw hit count.
よし攻め時だな。せい。よし。
Naturally, this also works in reverse. If an anchor crit you want to land fails, you can change the previous cards to have a different hit count total, and this will give you a second chance to land your crit.
いいですね。はい。ふっ。はっ。やっ。はい。お任せよ。やっ。
This mechanic essentially gives you a way to guarantee critical hits if you see an opportunity and a reason to do so. I mentioned save scumming while talking about the guaranteed crit mechanic, so let's go over that briefly since most of you know what this is already. Save scumming is when you intentionally exit out of your game app to reset the game back to your last turn in order to avoid bad RNG from enemies or to apply a skill that you meant to use but forgot to.
さてさて。はやっ。私輝いてます。
This works because FGO saves its game states in increments, these increments being your turns since it's the ones you control. No matter what happens after you select your card chain to attack, and so long as you do it before your servants move forward to signal the start of your next turn, if you exit out of the game, restart and go back into your fight, your game will reset back to your last played turn before you selected your card chain.
さてさて。はい。私輝いてます。
The main utility of save scumming is to alter enemy behavior when it's their turn to attack. In order to do so, you must use a servant's skill, a mystic code skill, or even a command spell. Each time you use one, this alters enemy behavior RNG, though they can end up doing the same thing as before because, well, RNG, but you can use this tactic to potentially save a low HP servant who would have died because the enemy targeted them one turn, but didn't because you changed their RNG by using a skill. The overkill mechanic is when a servant's attack drops an enemy's HP below 0 and continues attacking. Specifically, overkill is triggered starting with the first hit after the killing blow, or the hit that takes an enemy's HP down to 0 in the first place. By triggering overkill, your servant can produce 50% more MP gen and 30% more star gen for every overkill hit they land. There are 2 quote-unquote bugs associated with the overkill mechanic. The simpler one is the fact that any killing blow, the hit that drops an enemy's HP to 0 itself, regardless of where it comes from or what it is, also gets overkill bonuses for whatever reason. This isn't as well known since the impact of it is very hard to notice in most circumstances, but that's understandable in the context of this next bug.
了解。
どこだ。背中を受け負った。どこだ。
The second bug, the one that's more well known and documented, occurs when a servant takes an enemy's HP below half. When this happens, all of that servant's hits afterwards receive overkill bonuses, including the hit that knocked the enemy below half HP to begin with.
こっちだ。了解。ああ、そうか。
According to this Reddit thread by user Faffy with the help of Zio and TJM, the game checks for whether or not a face card has hits that induce overkill using these two logic strings, and it does this for all 3 cards and the extra. Normally the strings are supposed to reset their damage calculations going into a new card, but they don't, and instead keep them going into the next card, which is how this bug is caused. In essence, this halves the necessary amount of HP you need to reduce on an enemy in order to activate overkill on it, but without the game realizing that it's doing this. Or if you want to think of it this way, it unintentionally takes half as long than normal to trigger overkill in order to get its effects. This bug only applies in relative thresholds. In other words, you need to do half an enemy's current HP and damage to trigger this bug. So if an enemy has 100,000 HP, for example, the first turn you need to do at least 50k for your cards to activate the bug. And the next turn, if the enemy has 30k remaining, you need to do at least another 15k before you get the bug again. Altogether, the overkill mechanic and its bugs are big reasons why arts and later on quick MP loops are possible, like the Neurofest Summer Mordred strats and Scotty memes, and why videos that show certain servants gaining 300% MP charge off their single arts cards, like Lily Akina's video with Musashi or the one with Ereshigal, exist. Curiously, the overkill bugs also work against you too, and you gain more defensive MP charge when this happens.
了解。残念。ごめん。念には念を。そう。
はい。
仰せの通りに。
承諾。
計略だ。
MP gauges are automatically rounded up to 100% if at any point a servant reaches 99% charge. This can be from the servant hitting 99% off their very last hit, or from the last hit that they take from the enemy, and this even applies in the middle of a multi-hit attack, both offensively and defensively.
ちょっと不安ですけど。わかりました、先輩。
どうかな。
このくらいなら。
Any kind of MP charge skill also causes this to happen, including passives. For example, if you give Jalter a limit broken IE and then give her 20% charge from somewhere else, the next turn Jalter will charge up to full thanks to her passive giving her 4% charge every turn. Since she hits 99%, the game considers that, quote, close enough, so she starts with 100% charge going into turn 2, when she really should have had only 99.
行こ
う。はい。
よし。
わかりました、先輩。
いざ。
くらえ。
This mechanic exists as an anti-frustration measure because the devs probably had the foresight to realize that players would likely run into a lot of situations where they were literally 1% off having a full MP bar. And sure enough, this happens more often than you think, due to the fact that similar to percentages in Melee, MP bars also have decimal points that the game doesn't show you, so ending up in situations where you have somewhere in between 99 to 100% becomes more feasible.
一切承知。仰せの通りに行くぞ。罠だ。罠だ。
The only exception to this rounding mechanic is when a servant loses charge in any way. If a servant has 109% charge and they lose 10%, the game will not round up. This is, as far as I know, the only way for a servant to have 99% physically displayed on their MP bars. For what it's worth, initially only the iOS version of FGO featured this rounding mechanic where the game would round you up even if you hit 99% flat, like we did with the Jalter example, whereas the Android version only rounded you up if you managed to go over 99% in any capacity, but not at 99% flat. This has since been changed to where both versions now round you up even if you hit exactly 99%. Assuming you have a decently filled friends list, the support list takes 12 people from your friends list at a time to display their servants for you before you start a quest. The game tries to pick half those friends who've logged in within an hour, and the other 6 whose last logins were over an hour ago. The game also throws in 8 randoms, even if those randoms don't have any servants posted in the category of support servant that you're looking in. Because of this, and because most of the people on your friends list aren't actively relogging all the time, the people who have recent login times under an hour are generally displayed more often than those those who haven't. This is very important during heavy farming periods so that people can find whoever they need more frequently, and thus more friend points get generated for everyone involved. I've made a whole nother video explaining why friend points are important, so go watch that in case you don't know why they are. In order to reset your login time, you can relog by going to My Room and exiting out to the main menu. Daily and login resets along with data updates automatically send you back to the main menu, so these are technically relogs too. A faster way to relog though is by going to your support list and changing a CE. Because you're altering your support list, your device sends that data to the server, which updates your support list so that your friends can see the change, and it gives you a free relog along the way. And lastly, breakbar buff blocking. Buff blocking is intended to deny enemy buffs, but hilariously you can also use and deny buffs that enemies tend to give themselves off a broken breakbar. Breakbar buffs can't be removed with buff removal effects, but since the game treats their initial applications as the same as any other buff, simply blocking them from ever applying is their one true counter. Gibraltar is perhaps the most consistent application of this because her MP applies a one-time buff block, and you can continue using her as a Buster Crit meme for consistent damage. Theoretically, if you can recharge her MP fast enough and the enemy has enough health, you should be able to deny all the breakbar buffs that an enemy is supposed to give themselves and never have to deal with them in the first place. Special thanks to Hong, Officer, and SOA for help and clarification with the explanations of some of the things that this video has covered, and thanks for watching.